late. We just wanted to make sure that we had the majority of participants logged in and ready to go. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to join us today. As you know, we'll be looking at part 2 of a 3-part series of, quite frankly, the most comprehensive distribution analysis that's been undertaken by Cindy Estes-Green and Mark Lamano. Let me also, just from the outset, take a moment to let you know a couple of housekeeping tips. First of all, since this is a fairly large conference call, we've gone ahead and muted everyone's phones. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, and we do encourage you to ask questions, just take a minute and enter those in the Q&A box on your screen, and then we'll make sure to respond to your question following Cindy and Mark's presentation. Our panelists can see your questions, and so again, they may choose to simply speak to them during their presentation. So with that, let me take a moment now to officially thank and welcome Cindy and Mark. Again, really appreciate the tremendous work that they've done in their unprecedented study of the digital marketplace and distribution. So with that, Cindy and Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. We're very happy to be here and to be part of this program. So as everyone knows, this is a preview of part 2. We're expecting it to be released in the next couple of weeks. And this part of the Demystifying book is really about the hotel performance. So it's really looking at data from, as we have mentioned in previous discussions, looking at over 25,000 hotels, individual transactions going back to 2011. However, the analysis that we'll share today is focused on 2014 to 2016, and we cut off our analysis in June when we were working on this portion of the book. So everything you'll see is from June, year-to-date June of 2014, 15, and 16. In addition to the guest stay data and the cost of sales data from many hotel companies, we also have Airbnb, supply and demand, consumer review data, and loyalty details, not down to individual personal details of each person in the loyalty program, but we know which stays were related to a loyalty stay. So as you know, part 1 was released in September that looked at the overall marketplace. We'll talk about hotel performance, and then by later in the spring, we'll have the final section of the book that talks about how your teams can use some of this data to do a deeper dive analysis in your own properties. So just to get some definitions clarified, because we'll refer to these throughout the course of the presentation, when we look at revenue that's derived from all of these millions of stays, we start off looking at the traditional, what you might think of as a P&L revenue. We call it hotel collected revenue, but we actually add on top of that the payments that are made directly to third-party vendors by customers. So that would be wholesale commissions paid to wholesalers, opaque, and merchant model OTAs. Because really what we wanted to derive was what the guests actually paid, because the guests actually paid more than what shows up on the hotel P&L. And we want to record that and be able to track that, because what the guests pay is obviously a meaningful number to show what the market demand really, what is reflected in market demand. Once we define the guest paid revenue, we then remove direct costs from that revenue. So direct costs such as wholesale commissions, retail commissions, loyalty fees, channel and transaction fees. So we take those direct costs that are associated with a transaction and we come up with what we call the COPE revenue. And COPE is an acronym for contribution to operating profit and expense. And it's a kind of net revenue, but all we take away are the costs that are triggered when a transaction is consummated. And that COPE revenue, and this chart, I should say, is not to scale, so the numbers don't look quite like this. The COPE revenue reflects the direct costs associated with the transactions. And then finally, we remove one more cost, which is the sales and marketing cost, and we end up with what we call net revenue. So the sales and marketing cost is not the kind of cost that can be attributed to specific transactions. So it's things like sales payroll, franchise fees, social media costs, generalized media costs. All of those costs would be taken out of sales and marketing. And even though loyalty cost generally gets bucketed with sales and marketing according to uniform system of accounts, we actually isolate that and include it in our COPE revenue calculation because it's related to the consummation of a transaction. So the loyalty cost is triggered when the transaction happens. So we don't double count it, but we separate those two costs because the COPE expenses are those that can be looked at on an individual channel basis. So I'm going to turn over for a moment to Mark, and he'll take you through some of the high-level national figures.
Thanks, Cindy. As Cindy just mentioned, there's the 4 categories of revenue: guest paid revenue, hotel collected revenue, COPE revenue, and net revenue. In the 12 months ending of June 2016, you can see that the guests paid, a relatively healthy 4.6% more in paying for the room than they did in the 12 months prior to that. But at each step along the cost of acquisition ladder, you see that the industry gets a little bit less efficient. So, for example, on this chart, you'll see that the net revenue number was 4%. So even though the guests paid 4.6% more in purchasing rooms, only 4% of that was available from a net revenue standpoint, meaning that the hotels had a little bit less than the guests actually paid in incremental revenue to actually operate the property going forward. As you look at this chart, if the industry is efficient, then in terms of how much money they spend in acquiring the guests, those bars would all be at about the same level, 4.6, 4.6, 4.6. If the chart's trending downward like it is here, then you get a situation where the industry is actually paying a little bit more than they had the year before to get the guests in the door. And if the bars were trending in an upward direction, then just the opposite would be happening in terms of how you look at whether the efficiency of is getting better or less efficient. The next chart takes those numbers and extrapolates them to the industry as a whole. If you concentrate on the darker blue lines at the top of each of those 4 sets of bars, you'll see that in the 12 months ending in June of 2016, guests paid about $146.9 billion purchasing hotel rooms. When you go down the relative categories of then how much went out in transaction fees that were not part of the P&L, the transaction costs that were part of the P&L, and then the sales and marketing expense, you get down to a net revenue figure of $123.3 billion, which means that of the $146.9 billion that guests spent, hotels spent approximately $23.6 billion to actually get them in the door. So again, the cost of acquisition is fairly substantial. If you apply a percentage to that, which we do and we call revenue capture, which you see circled there on the chart, you can see that in the most recent time period, the industry had a revenue capture of 83.9%. And that is simply an easy calculation, which is just net revenue divided by guest paid revenue. So it's basically what percentage do we then get to keep as an industry. And that number was 83.9%, and you can see that declined slightly from the year before, where it was 84.4%. Now, that decline of 0.5% doesn't seem all that dramatic, but if you were to make an assumption that the industry behaved in the most recent 12 months in terms of acquiring the customer and how expensive it was to get the customer in the door and what channels they used and how much fees they paid and how loyalty costs, and that behavior was exactly the same in 2016 as it has been in 2015. If you look back up at the top of the chart, you could see that that equated to $729 million more dollars that the industry spent. So looking at that in the reverse, so if the industry had behaved exactly the same, like I said before, then they would have had $729 million more in profit in 2016 than they did in the year before. Now, if you're an owner of a hotel and you wanted to apply, like just to pick a number, an 8% cap rate to apply to that, that resulted in about a $9 billion decline in asset value over the 12-month period, which is substantial. And whether that's at the industry level or at the property level, it makes for a relatively significant change. The next chart, as Cindy talked about, when you add back the amount of guest-paid revenue that never shows up on a P&L, it actually affects the ADR of the property and for the industry as a whole. So we estimate over the most current time period that that expenditure that guests spent was about $3, meaning that ADRs reported from a P&L are about $3 lower nationally than the guest actually paid. And in some markets, it could be substantially higher than that depending on the business mix. Now, if you look at this chart, it's in the three color bars. What we're attempting to show is, again, looking at 2016, the guest paid $123 to purchase the room. About $3 of that never showed up on a P&L as part of the non-P&L transaction costs. The green is the P&L transaction cost, was another $7.50. So a hotel has about $10.50 less than the guest actually paid to actually then go toward operations, and this is pre-sales and marketing expense. Now, focusing your attention just briefly on the percentages on the top in the red, you can see that guests paid, again, over the 2-year period, about 8.4% in incremental revenue purchasing rooms. And looking at the COPE ADR all the way to the left, you see that the hotels spent about had about 7.8% more revenue from that, which is lower, obviously, than the 8.4, and that's because the rise in the cost of the transaction costs, both P&L and non-P&L, continue to rise. Looking now at, in the most recent time period, how guests booked their rooms and through what channel, you can see it from this chart, and it shows all the categories. 42% of all the bookings in the past year were done through an electronic channel, which are the ones circled, which are brand.com, GDS, and OTA. Now, that 42% number is up from 35% from 2014, meaning that guests are much more frequently becoming comfortable with the electronic channels, and a higher percentage of them continue to use those, mostly at the expense of property direct. When the guests use the OTA channel, this is kind of how the three agency models are shown as a percentage. In 2016, you can see that the most dominant OTA model was still the net or merchant model at the majority of the bookings through the OTA channels, and both that and the retail, which is in the yellow, were growing while opaque declined. This data was a little bit surprising to us because we had expected to see that either a flattening or a declining in the net merchant retail model as a percentage of total OTA sales, but that hasn't been the case as consumers continue to end up going through that channel. On the next chart, you'll see that same pie chart data from 2 slides ago, but this time shown as bars, and it shows the years 2014, 2016, just to show you how the guest bookings are evolving. The 3 sets of blue bars to the left are channels directly to the hotel, and the bars, the 3 orange bars to the right are indirect channels, and then there's group over to the right-hand side at about 14%. Speaking of group, a lot of the data that you may have seen regarding the percentage of group sales would look much higher than that, typically in the 30% range, but that data was primarily focused on the high end of the marketplace, luxury, upper upscale, and upscale hotels. When you then factor in the group as a percentage of the entire industry sales, it ends up being at about 14%. Oversimplifying the data on this chart just a little bit, you'll see where the 3 arrows are: property direct, brand.com, and OTA. So again, oversimplifying, what's basically happening is guests at an increasing number are booking less and less through property direct, meaning driving up, walking in the door, and using an electronic channel to do that. And when they do that, that movement's either going to brand.com or OTA, which you can see are both growing relatively healthy, brand.com at 9%, OTA at 28%. So, as the consumers continue to do that going forward, it becomes contingent upon the industry to recognize that they're going to be making that movement, and where are they going to go, again, primarily brand.com or OTA. If you want to kind of look at, group those kinds of transactions together, we basically can lump them into two categories, direct to the property and indirect. And like I mentioned earlier, direct is brand.com, voice, and property direct, and indirect is OTA, GDS, and FIT wholesale. Now, the way to read this chart is in 2014, for every room booked through an indirect channel, 3.3 were booked directly to the property. In 2016, that had dropped to, for every room booked for an indirect channel, 2.7 were booked directly to the hotel, which means that, as was spoken about in the slides prior to this, there's a shift away from the direct channels to the indirect channels, and that's something that the industry needs to keep an eye on, again, primarily focused on that property direct category. Excuse me? Oh, the question is the definition of property direct. And that property direct is basically things, either people driving up or walking in. Depending on what segment you're in, property direct can be a much higher percentage of your business than other segments. For example, the economy and mid-scale segments of the industry have a much higher percentage of property direct, some as high as 70 or 80%. And at the higher end, upper upscale and luxury, it tends to be a much smaller percentage of property direct. Yeah. And the other thing that's in property direct is, in addition to, walk-ins and drive-ins, is crews and that kind of business, contract and crew business. Now, the next slide shows the growth in revenue and cost categories from 2014, index 2014. And if all these costs were growing at the same rate of revenue, which is in the gray bar, two from the bottom, they would all be about the same. So you see loyalty, investment, retail commissions, and channel costs, and it kind of in the same ballpark as guest paid revenue. But you also see that OTA commissions are growing at a much faster rate. So despite the fact that there's been a lot of conversations about negotiating the actual percentage of each booking with a lower fee through some of the OTAs, the only way the math works on this chart for that number to be growing like that is there has to be an increasing number of rooms booked through the channel, which again, as shown on this chart, is an increasingly expensive channel. Looking at, a way to describe the relative costs of channels, we basically have taken the direct channels, again, the three to the left, brand.com, voice, and property direct, and then the three to the right, OTA, GDS, and FIT, wholesale. You can see the relative cost structure. We index this to property direct being 100 because that is the most cost-efficient channel for the guests to actually book a room. And the way to read this is, if you look at, brand.com, for example, versus property direct, it's about 2.6 times more expensive for a guest to book through brand.com to the property than it is to just walk in the door. And conversely, looking at the OTA, that's over 6 times as expensive as the property coming, as the guest coming into the property. So again, the direct channels being much more cost efficient than the indirect channels. And again, that's not to say that any of these channels is better or worse, and there's reasons to use all of them, but there's cost associated with every channel, and this just helps to highlight that. This chart shows loyalty demand by each of the chain scale categories and presents the percentage of rooms booked by loyalty members in each of the 3-year time periods. And you'll see that some segments have a much higher loyalty percentage of bookings through loyalty guests than others, particularly like in the middle to upper end of the marketplace, much less so at the lower end of the marketplace. But going forward, this is becoming a very important category for branded and even independent hotels to have loyalty members come directly to them. Loyalty members tend to book more frequently through brand.com, and so the big push to increase loyalty members is a long-term strategy to kind of shift consumer behavior. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy, and she'll continue.
So what I'd like to do is introduce some variations by hotel segment and give you a little bit of insight into how the segments differ, So for most of the analysis, we group the traditional chain scales into lower tier, middle tier, and upper tier. So lower tier is economy and mid-scale, middle tier is upper mid-scale, and upper tier is upscale, upper upscale, and luxury. And the nature of the business in those categories was very similar, so it made sense to group them together to just look at their patterns. So I'll just draw your attention to a few things that we see. With the lower tier, which again is economy and mid-scale, they had the strongest growth in guest paid revenue. So the numbers we're looking at, this is RevPAR numbers, and we wanted to look, just like I had said in the beginning, the definitions, what's the guest paid revenue derived number, so the guest paid RevPAR versus the hotel collected RevPAR, which is the traditional RevPAR number that you are familiar with. And then there's the COPE RevPAR, which is the RevPAR after the direct costs are removed from it. So again, in the lower tier, they had the fastest growth in guest paid RevPAR. However, they had the biggest gap between the guest paid RevPAR and the COPE RevPAR, meaning that even though the guests paid more and to the tune of 4.1% growth, the hotels were only able to retain growth at 3.1%, which means that gap was is sort of the documentation of the inefficiency to acquire those customers. So basically, the economy and mid-scale hotels spent a lot more money to get those customers. They weren't able to capture the full value of that 4.1% growth. And now the middle tier, you see, is kind of in the middle. I'll just immediately look to the upper tier, just in contrast. They didn't have quite the same growth in guest paid RevPAR, only 2.2%, but they actually were able to retain most of that because their COPE RevPAR was 2.1%. So they were the most efficient in effect. And then the middle tier was kind of in the middle. So the numbers that everybody tends to look at repeatedly is the hotel collected. That's the traditional number. But you'll see there's pretty big variation when you can actually look at the difference based on the costs that are taken away from what the guests actually paid. So to look at this another way, when we look at that same direct to indirect ratio that Mark talked about earlier, we broke this out by tier, and you can see that lower tier, economy and mid-scale hotels, had by far the largest number of direct bookings for every indirect. So in 2014, they had almost 6 bookings directly for every one that came indirectly. However, by 2016, it dropped by 33% down to only 4 direct bookings for every one booked directly. 4 direct bookings for every one booked indirectly. So the big drop, and it's the same thing connected to the previous slide with the RevPAR, the mid-scale and the economy hotels had a big shift in their property direct business, the walk-in drive-in business, very heavily to OTA. So all of those, the customers that shifted, a lot of them shifted directly into the OTA channel, which means the same customer that used to cost very little to bring in is now costing a whole bunch more. And that's the largest reason why they're the basis of the inefficiency. You'll see there was a 19% drop in the mid-scale, or in the middle range, which is the upper mid-scale hotels, 19% drop, and then the least amount of drop in the upper tier of only 8%. And I'll get into a little more detail on the nature of that. So in the upper tier, some of the benefits and the reasons why they had such a strong revenue capture performance was, and you'll see this when you get the full book, we didn't want to go into every detail today, but they had by far the largest reduction in opaque OTA. I mean, some of the chain scales were like 25% drop in opaque OTA. At the same time, they had the largest increase in brand.com, and brand.com actually grew faster than OTA for the first time in 5 years, probably driven by the Book Direct campaigns. So in total, the upper tier actually was quite efficient and looked pretty good in the analysis from 2014 to 16. The middle and lower tier actually had the most guest paid revenue growth, which was great. They just had this shifting in the property direct, which actually worked against them in terms of efficiency. And then one other side comment on a specific chain scale, the only chain scale that actually had growth in the opaque OTA was economy. Everybody else was negative, and economy actually had, I think it was about a 6% growth in opaque OTA. So just in summarizing, guest paid revenue is growing at a healthy clip overall across the industry, 4.6%. The net revenue is also rising. It's just not rising at the same rate, which we had referred to earlier, only 4%, and that gap is related to the higher expense in acquiring the very same business. We're paying on average in the U.S. hotels 16 to 18%, and many hotels, hundreds, thousands, are paying 25 to 35%, although the average is still 16 to 18. OTA commissions rising 3 times the rate of guest paid revenue. The OTA channel is at 12.4%, which is lower than some people thought, and brand.com is 20%, which is quite high and almost double. However, as we know, the rate of growth on the OTA channel is accelerating, and brand.com has grown. It is on a higher base, but it's not growing quite at the same rate. Although with the Book Direct campaigns, we did see acceleration in the growth of brand.com. Loyalty contribution generally, as Mark pointed out, 40 to 60% and growing fast. And it is, I didn't include it in this analysis, but we did some ROIs on the loyalty investment versus OTA and other investments, and it's substantially more, the numbers just come out better right now. And then another point, which we didn't get into much detail on, the meta search, even though it doesn't show up as a large player, meta search like Google and Trivago are gaining substantially. They don't show up anywhere close to the amount of business of the legacy OTAs, but what they're doing is they're higher up in the sales funnel, so to speak, so they're actually pitting the brands against the OTAs and causing overall acquisition costs to rise. So the costs for everybody are going up because customers are going through these meta search sites and apps on their way to make their booking, and it's actually causing increased costs for everybody. So just to shift over, we do not have a section in the Demystifying book on Book Direct, but there's been a lot of interest in looking at the results, and because we had the data, we could do some analysis, and I'd like to share that with the group. So we looked at it four or five different ways, actually, and I'll share some highlights of that. One of the things that we looked at was the rate differential, because there's been a lot of discussion, and Expedia had come out with an infographic, some of you may remember, saying that OTA bookings are 8% greater advantage to a hotel than a brand.com booking after the discounts were taken. We ran those average rates a few different ways, and the first way, which is sort of the highest level cut, is just saying, let's take all the loyalty guests that book through brand.com, all loyalty guests, not just the Book Direct, not just those buying the Book Direct product, but all loyalty guests coming through brand.com versus all OTA guests. And we did it on a net basis. So we took all the direct costs out, commissions, transaction fees, channel costs, loyalty costs. We removed all of that, and of course the discount is included here. And we ended up with a pretty good differential. I mean, I'm just showing you upper upscale. We didn't have the others ready yet, but ranging from 12 to 20% premium on the brand.com booking when compared to the OTA booking on a net basis. Now, of course, this may include a portion of brand.com buyers who may be loyalty guests, but they weren't necessarily buying the Book Direct program. So we wanted to look specifically at those. So we isolated them and we said just the Book Direct member rate code, let's just look at those buyers and compare that net rate against the net rate of the OTAs. And we still have a pretty good differential, and you can see it varies a lot. In this case, I was able to pull the luxury data, 18% differential, down to upper mid-scale, which is a 3.4% differential. So obviously this reduces quite a bit, and when you start putting discounts in there, it brings the numbers closer, but no matter what, it's still a premium over the OTA average rate. And some of you probably are thinking, oh yes, but we would have gotten more because if we didn't have to give the discount, then those same customers would have paid even more. And yes, there's definitely some portion of the business, there was a trade-off, a trade-down, and we did an analysis, which I'll tell you a little bit about, where we actually calculated that trade-down relative to the rates and all the other costs involved to see how much we were ending up with. But before I do that, I just want to share some of the room night differentials. So what we did here, I'll draw your attention to the red bar, and that red bar represents the total U.S. The blue, green, and yellow represents some specific cities we looked at, Chicago, Dallas, and New York. So let's just look at the red one. And what we did here was we said, for the digital channels, brand.com, OTA, and GDS, what portion did each of those three contribute to the total transient growth? So if total transient growth in all of the U.S. was 2.6%, which is what it was for, this is calendar year 2016 over 2015, with 2.6% growth, how much of that 2.6 was attributed to brand.com, to OTA, and to GDS? And we see that the brand.com was 2.5 points of that 2 points of that 2.6, and the OTA and GDS was substantially less. So by far, the brand.com was the lion's share of that growth, which we had not seen that in previous periods at all. These numbers that we're looking at represent upper upscale hotels specifically. So just by contrast, I have the same chart for upscale hotels, which had a 4.6% growth. And we see the same general pattern, maybe not quite as dramatic, but brand.com still is more than double the contribution of growth for overall transient business when compared to OTA and GDS as well. And then finally, we look at upper mid-scale hotels, and we have the same general pattern. Again, not quite as dramatic as the upper upscale, but we still see that brand.com contribution is still considerably more. And just as a contrast, I would say if you look at the yellow bars for New York City, it didn't quite work out that way. In New York City, OTA actually was the largest contributor to growth, followed by brand.com and then last GDS. And for upper mid-scale, the overall transient growth was 3.35. So the question is what portion of that growth is attributed to brand.com, portion to OTA, and the portion to GDS. So it appears that the activity in 2016 around Book Direct had some effect on the brand.com growth because we haven't seen this dramatic a gap between the growth. With OTA growing so much more quickly, it's actually notable that brand.com actually was growing faster as a percentage of the total growth. Then we did another analysis. What we wanted to do was we ran a linear regression, and we wanted to actually see if there was no Book Direct campaign and everything just continued on the same path that it had been on over the last couple of years. Let's extend the numbers out, and the data we're looking at is May through November, which was the heart of when most of the Book Direct campaigns were out in the market. So for the period of May through November, what was the pattern in terms of what we would have expected through brand.com, what we would have expected from OTA? And the dotted line represents what we would have expected for brand.com. What we would have expected is the green dotted line. What we actually saw was the solid green line, which meant that brand.com was definitely higher than it would have been if all else stayed the same. And OTA, the same. It was lower than what we would have expected, except for the month of July, which was about what we would have expected. And in the summer, there was definitely big uptick in OTA business, no matter what was going on. So it appears that, again, just looking for evidence of some of this Book Direct activity in the market, if there in fact was any notable change in brand.com, which we see that there was some evidence of that. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about was the trade down analysis. So it's not all a rosy picture. When we actually took 12,000 hotels and we created a trade down model to figure out, based on a percentage that would have taken the discount, that didn't need to take the discount, and those who would have booked on OTA but didn't book at all, those who would have booked on OTA but booked on brand.com. I mean, there were a whole bunch of different scenarios. We built a model and we ran 12,000 hotels through it to see what was the net cost to these hotels. And what we found turned out to be kind of a bell curve. So there were hotels that had pretty big losses, and there were hotels that had actual pretty good gains, and then the middle of the bell curve, there was actually most of the hotels had sort of modest gain or modest loss. So when we start thinking about the Book Direct campaigns and thinking, okay, there was definitely a trade down, and I'll kind of show you how we thought about this. There was a cost associated with those discounts and other kinds of trade downs, and we'll look at that on the left side. And those costs in terms of the medians for upper upscale, upscale, upper mid-scale hotels, and we're still continuing the analysis, but that's what's done so far, range from about a $17,000 to $35,000 cost for the properties. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't hotels on the long tail at either end that either had substantial gain and benefit or actually substantially greater loss. So the median, which meant half was greater than this number and half was lower than this number, was between $17,000 and $35,000. So then you say, well, we were doing these discounts to gain more loyalty members. So the question is, how many more loyalty members do we need to get to make it worthwhile? So we took some of the numbers from the brands, like average number of stays, lifetime stays for a loyalty member, average length of stay for a loyalty guest, average rate paid, and so on. And we said, just on average, somewhere between $500 and $1,500 is the amount that was that a loyalty guest might bring after in the course of their 2, 3, 5 stays, whatever it is, on average. So how many of them do you actually need in order to compensate for that cost? And the question is, can you get enough lifetime value to be greater than what you incurred for that first visit cost? And that's kind of the transactional analysis in a very simple kind of way. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that. And then you start thinking, well, what are the other peripheral benefits of having more loyalty members? Better customer engagement, able to deliver better customer service. The hotels can diversify their sources of business so they don't get too dependent on one. Obviously, in a down cycle, if you're too dependent on one source of business, the rates can go up, commissions can go up. You're vying for the same business, and it will cost you more to get it. You may get less of it anyway because you're subject to, say, a third party to give it to you. So the more you can diversify your sources of business so you control some of them, the more stable you may be in terms of business foundation. So those are kind of the questions. It's like whatever the trade down is, and there were definitely hotels that really did not look good and had big losses. And there were hotels that actually had really strong gains, and then there were a whole bunch in the middle. And, the question is, can those hotels get enough new loyalty members to fill up and keep coming back? Not that every one of those Book Direct customers is going to keep coming back. You only need a certain proportion of them to come back. That's the bargain that's being made. And the question is, for the long-term benefit, is it worth the short-term cost? And as I said, we took 12,000 hotels and ran it through the model. And we'll go into more detail on that. We're going to actually publish a paper just on the Book Direct analysis. We may not publish all of these numbers publicly, but in this private setting, we are sharing it. And we'll have more to say about it, but I just wanted to share some of the early findings on this. So just wrapping up, we've got part 3 coming out later in the spring that will help your teams use different models to actually help figure out each hotel's optimal business mix, different kind of revenue and cost analytics that can be looked at. And the data that we've been collecting is not just for a one-time publication. We'll be publishing portions of it through AHLA quarterly, and we'll probably continue and have an annual report to maintain this as an industry resource. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and see if there's questions.
Wonderful, Cindy. Thank you and Mark so much. Listen, I'm going to turn things over to Rosanna and Maeda on our team, who will lead a Q&A period. So, Rosanna?
Thanks, Catherine. And just a reminder to folks on the phone, you can type in a question by going to the right-hand side of your screen where it says QA, and if you type that, we can read those aloud. We do have a couple questions already for Cindy and Mark. One question is for the lower tier, was there a market increase in occupancy?
Yes, and we actually, in the book, we have all the details for the lower tier in terms of occupancy, net ADR, hotel payday. We have all those numbers. So you'll be able to, each of the readers will be able to dig into that and look at that. I don't remember the exact percentage changes. So I'll defer to when the book comes out, which hopefully will be within a week or so, and you'll be able to look that up.
And just as a reminder, we will be sending out the full recording of this webinar in the next day to all of you on the phone so that you have it and can take your time to dig into the data. One other question, Cindy, how do you see loyalty programs affecting consumer booking behavior? Is that a story played out in the data?
Yeah, so the loyalty programs, which obviously this whole discussion of the Book Direct is the beginning signs of that. And, you know, I don't think any one of us wants brand.com to become a discount channel, but, you know, the early entry into the market to see if consumers could be, their behavior could be changed, I think we definitely saw very definitive evidence of that it could be changed. And the question is, at what cost? And I think that no one wants to see discounts being the only incentive going forward as the method for changing that behavior. But, you know, we also see, and in our Book Direct white paper, we'll get into more detail on this, but, you know, loyalty programs are evolving. They're no longer just point-based. You know, the whole thing is, what can you do to improve the guest experience enough to really alter their behavior? So you think about what we all do with airlines. You know, you use their app because you can choose your seat and check for your upgrades and other kind of benefits that you can only get when you book directly. You know, for hotels, are there other things like choose your own room and keyless entry and mobile check-in and, you know, things that just remove the friction from the travel experience? And for those hotel companies, and this will be big companies or small, it isn't just the big brands, there will be technology that can help support that to make the travel experience more seamless. And for those companies that can have that built into the loyalty model so that those things happen more easily and more seamlessly for the loyalty member, that will change their behavior because everyone will go for the path that's got less friction in it. So I think it's incumbent on the brands and even small brands and independents to find the tools in order to enable that, because whoever does that, if the third parties like the OTAs and MetaSearch provide that, then the consumers will use that and the hotels will be left paying much higher costs for it. So I think that the loyalty programs, I mean, I've said a few times, loyalty contribution is kind of a new system contribution. You know, if you can get 60% of your hotel filled through loyalty members, and you have another 20% of group, then all of a sudden there's only 20 more to fill. You know, you can do that more efficiently and your overall cost will be much lower. So, you know, I think that's the goal of these loyalty programs is it's the most powerful tool that the brands have with much lower budgets. I mean, the brands are not spending $6 billion a year in marketing, but the loyalty programs pack a pretty powerful punch. And, you know, it's a question of trying to build them up and not, you know, discounting is not going to be something that's sustainable, but it was an understandable first entry into the market in order to change behavior, and it definitely woke up the consumers, and plenty of channel agnostic consumers actually changed their behavior. Not all, but plenty of them did.
Thanks, Cindy. I think we have one final question here for you. What, in your opinion, is driving the customer behavior that is leading to the growth of OTA bookings?
It's convenience. Like, it's what I was talking about. Whoever makes the most seamless, friction-free experience for the consumer, whether it's through the booking or the stay experience, that's what the consumer will choose. So if the OTAs make it easier and more convenient, then the consumers will go there. And I think that if the hotels and hotel companies and brands and everybody else can make it more seamless and easier for the consumer, they will have lots of reason, especially if it's experience-based. You know, if you can make my stay better, easier, simpler, I get more of my preferences, or you recognize more of the ways that I like to do things, that's going to just create a bias for direct bookings that is far more powerful and has much stronger holds than a discount. So I think it's, you know, it's convenience and kind of friction-free, seamless travel experience. That's what I think is driving the behavior, whether it's for the growth of OTA or others.
Thank you, Cindy. I think that was all the time we had for, so I want to thank you and Mark for your analysis. And again, for folks on the phone, we will be sending you the full presentation, and the second chapter will be available in the next week or so, and we'll make sure that you receive that as well. Thank you all for your time, and have a pleasant afternoon.